Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and right now we're looking at Hazel of the Rootbloom. This is a squirrel food deck that comes to us from Shirok. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, Shirok. Shirok is looking for a general look at the deck. This is an upgraded precon, and I would say a very upgraded precon, and honestly, already it has so many things I really like. I don't really have a lot of game objects matter decks. Those are like clue decks, food decks, treasure decks, things like that, where you're not just using the tokens for their intentional purpose, but you're taking advantage of the fact that you are generating generally a lot of artifact tokens. And these kind of strategies are a lot of fun because you can fill the board with all sorts of just like free tokens and then use them all in this case, an aristocrat strategy. And therefore, music to my ears. So we do have some things to go into. My list of additions is honestly rather small. I really do like this deck, which means we're going to be going through it with a fine-tooth comb. We are going to try to simplify some things, and we're going to try to be, I don't know, a little critical of a few of the card choices, because at this point, the only way we can really improve the deck is by nitpicking. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the commander and see what we can do for this deck. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Hazel of the Rootbloom, and why is she our green-black, I was gonna say 4 mana. Why is she 4 mana? Why is she our squirrel food commander? Hazel of the Rootbloom is a 4 mana green-black 3/5 squirrel druid. She has 2 abilities. The first one is tap her, pay 2 life, tap X untapped tokens you control, add X mana in any combination of colors. And then, of course, what I think is the much more powerful ability and the important one, at the beginning of your end step, create a token that's a copy of target token you control. If that token is a squirrel, instead create 2 tokens that are copies of it. Now, just on the front and just looking at this commander and the things you can do with it, Hazel provides a lot of interesting stats and abilities. I think one of the most interesting things about Hazel is her stat line. Having a 3/5 for 4 mana is really strong. These Bloomburrow commanders feel very pushed, and this is just an example of how far Magic power creep has gotten. The idea of having such a powerful mana generator and token doubler, and she's a 3/5 for 4, is kind of bonkers if you ask me. That being said, generally you will be using her as, as a mana producer and doubler, not so much an attacker. And with that in mind, she is very powerful. Like being able to generate, let's say, conservatively 3 mana generally off of her first ability is real good. That can accelerate you by playing other combo pieces, by playing out value pieces, by even playing into more ramp. And that second ability, at the beginning of your end step, create a token that's a copy of target token you control, is really interesting. Now, in this deck, it's trying to take advantage of that squirrel clause by getting 2 tokens, 2 populate triggers, let's say. But I think that's something that's really interesting about this, is that this is not populate, because populate is creature token, whereas Hazel is any token. That being said, a lot of the tokens that you're going to be able, that are non-creature, you're going to be able to double, aren't very good. We're thinking food, we're thinking treasure. These are the things that we generally are easy to make, but that's not saying there aren't other options. I'm not going to go into them too much, but if you were to play a deck that was using a artifact cloning mechanic or a enchantment cloning mechanic, that's something we can find in green-black, something like that, to create a token of a non-creature permanent, being able to create a copy of it is something that's a lot more difficult in these colors to do, and therefore Hazel has more value that way. That being said, this wouldn't work on like Planeswalkers or something that green-black has a lot of good options with, because it does not remove legendary clause and you would just lose the copy Planeswalker. But that's not what we're doing here. Let's take a look at the deck itself. Now, Before we go further into it, let's just generalize this deck and get an idea for it. This is an Artifact Aristocrats deck that can still benefit from some of the more general Aristocrat packages. So for example, cards such as Marionette Apprentice tend to do double duty here because it is using, it gains you triggers off of both creatures and artifacts dying, whereas still we get, the classic Zulaport Cutthroat effects, which are just as powerful. With that in mind, we've got a lot of really, really good pieces. We're playing some of the strongest cards in these colors, and a lot of both tutors and powerful interaction. The power level of this deck is rather high. And like I said before, that means we're going to be really picky. And for me, that pickiness is going in to be about mana and higher CMC or mana value cards. Talking about mana, let's do our, general 2 steps we do whenever we look at any deck. We're going to look at our land count and our mana curve. Now, our land count here is 30, and that feels criminally low. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand the method to this madness. As you might see, there are a lot of 1 mana creatures, mana dorks, and we do have quite a few mana rocks, and I believe doesn't really look like we have any other ramp, really. It's mainly our mana rocks, and then we go, our mana dorks and mana rocks. Which none of these are bad things, these are very, very good things. However, it still leaves me wanting more. If you had watched, I have put out 2 instructional sounds silly, educational videos recently. One on land count and the other one on mana rocks. And we're going to cover both in this video, but let's talk about land count. The idea that I posited in that video is that the easiest way to look at it is take your land count and then start adding your mana rocks and your mana dorks after you hit those thresholds. So we can say that once we get to turn 2, or once we've played our first land, our number of lands increases, right? Llanowar Elves, Gilded Goose, kind of, Elvish Mystic, Elves of Deep Shadow, Deathrite Shaman, kind of, and Birds of Paradise. So I'm going to say about 5. We go from 30 to 35. If we subtract the land we played, we're about 34, which makes it easier for us to, quote unquote, hit our next land drop, which would be 2, and then we can add in Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Golgari Signet, Talisman of Resilience, right? And then we are getting a bit further ahead. However, even with that in mind, we are playing too few lands. At 30 lands, I'm getting nervous of our ability to have a opening hand that doesn't have 3 lands in it, that we're going to have 2 lands and a mana dork, or, 2 lands and no mana dork, even worse. And I think that's a real fear, and I think that's something that's worth considering. So with that in mind, some of the cuts that I might bring up, and partially why my addition list is so low, is I really would rather these cards be lands, right? Because I would like to increase our number of lands. I wouldn't mind having 1 or 2 forests, basics, forests and swamps, because of something like Earthcraft, just having, more resilience to someone who might be able to target them with Ghost Quarter and get rid of your basics. So with that in mind, I wouldn't mind just going up a few lands. 35 sounds great. I know it's not fun. I know we want to play all of our really cool spells over that, but I think reasonably we do have to play more lands. Looking at the mana curve itself, I think the curve looks really, really nice. 2 and 3 are the highest parts. 3 is, of course, somewhat alleviated by the fact that we have a lot of 1 mana dorks, which makes it easier to hit 3. But 2 is our general to hit, and we will get back to 2. Then we go to 4, then we go to 5, then we go to 7 for Protean Hulk, which is a part of a combo, and then we have Craterhoof Behemoth, with his, as we know, a one-shot defeat 1 or more of your opponents. So I do really, really like the curve. So when later in this video I start cutting at the curve at the 5 and 4 slots, don't take it as I don't want you to play 4 or 5 mana spells. I think there's this idea, especially in competitive games, especially if people like for me that come from one-on-one competitive formats like Modern, there's this idea that you might get from me that you should cut everything over 4 mana because it's not worth it. And I don't want to necessarily squash that idea because it is an important idea to consider. Like, there are a lot of 5 mana spells that are just not worth running over more 3 mana spells. This is a hint to a future video, but if your 5 mana spells are like, I don't know, like the are they Cavaliers, like the 5 mana enter the battlefield creatures, or I don't know, a 5 mana Kindred Lord, things like that, and your opponent's 3 mana spells are like Rhystic Study, Necropotence, the Black Market Connections, things like that. Like, they're not comparable spells. If you are looking for power, we can get higher and lower mana, so our 5 mana cards need to be impactful. It doesn't mean they need to be Necropotence level strong, but they need to be good, right? They need to feel like they're worth that 5 mana. So we're going to get to that in a second. I just want to momentarily go back to the Mana Rock discussion, as I said, because I just want to say I want to take out at least Golgari's Signet and Talisman of Resilience and just immediately slot them as lands. I could even be pushed further to say drop the Fellwar Stone because of a very nice collection of Mana Rocks. As said before though, it is worth considering something like being able to go turn 2 Arcane Signet or Fellwar Stone into a Birds of Paradise to use even more mana and ramp yourself even further. But these are like Magic Christmas land situations. I think in my Mana Rock video, a lot of people poo-pooed the idea of cutting a lot of Mana Rocks because they felt they were so essential to gameplay. And I would like to take those people into a room and start mulliganing with them. In that video I made about land count, I did some rudimentary math on how many cards in your deck to see reliably an effect on turn 2. And you needed to be playing 12 plus to be at a reasonable, or 14 or more to get a reasonable rate of drawing that card. So when we are looking at this need for Mana Rocks and we're playing 4 Mana Rocks, you're kind of losing me here. Like, if you think that, and this is not directed at this deck, but just this idea that, like, if you really think your deck requires these abilities so much, you should be running about 10 of them. And I know the argument I'm going to get is, well, that's stupid. And I'd say, yeah, it is, isn't it? So, like, run less. In this deck specifically, it's not just that I don't want to run these Mana Rocks, is I want to come back to this curve and look at this 2 mana slot and look at how many cards I would rather cast at 2 mana, right? Like, how many more? And it's not as much as you think, I will say, because some of these, such as Finale of Devastation, is not a 2 mana card. Chatterstorm, not a 2 mana card. Diabolic Intent is not necessarily a 2 mana card because you can't really cast it on turn 2. But a lot of these 2 mana creatures I would rather play. Holding up Abrupt Decay even early in the game makes a huge difference. Remember earlier when I said cards like Necropotence or Rhystic Study? This is a really good answer to them. Likewise, Saxon's Trophy. Imps Mischief even can be a really powerful early game tool if you want to use it correctly. So with those in mind, I just want to take a little pressure off the 2 mana valve, and those Mana Rocks are the ones that I kind of see as the easiest ones. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to talk about these 4 and 5 mana cards and see that these are the kind of cards I want to apply a little pressure to. And specifically, I want to talk about the 5 mana cards. And we're going to be really, really picky, like extremely picky. And I hope it'll be a good testament to how I would see a deck of this power level needs to be. And the first 2 examples are Deranged Hermit and Deep Forest Hermit. These are 2 5 mana cards that enable you to go wide. Deep Forest Hermit and Deranged Hermit basically have the same text, where they are a temporary creature that generates 4 squirrel tokens and then have the squirrels get +1/+1. Now, if you were to ask me, well, Kirst, what is the real power of these cards? It's not a hard one to figure out, right? Do not read into the Echo, do not read into the Vanishing, do not read into the all squirrels get +1/+1. The power of these cards is that simple line of text that says, create 4 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens. And I will admit that is really, really powerful. I'm generally a fan of anything that generates almost equivalently to its mana cost in tokens. I will say food, treasure, and clue tokens are more valuable than squirrel tokens, but 5 mana for 4 game objects is a pretty good price to pay. And I really do like it in tandem with these aristocrat effects that we have, because it basically translates into multiple triggers, right? If you had Bastion of Remembrance and Zulaport Cutthroat, and you generate these 4 creature tokens, that's 8 aristocrat triggers, as long as you have like Viscera Seer or something like that. And that is an amazing amount of value if you consider that's 8 life you gain and 24 life you take from your opponents. Like, that's really, really good at 5 mana, not including things like blockers, etc., etc. So I'm talking these cards up big. Why am I going to then suggest we take them out? Well, I'm going to suggest at this power level, 5 mana for this effect is actually starting to get a little tough, right? This is 5 mana that can walk into a board clear. This is 5 mana that can get pinged out by Goblin Bombardment or another anti-token strategy. This is 5 mana that needs to be used immediately to get you an immense amount of advantage. And it's not that I don't want this, it's just I don't want to spend 5 mana on it. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean I want to use reanimation effects. I mean I want to use green cheap creatures into play effects, which we do have at least one with Court of Calling. So it's not very much so impossible in this deck. We also have Finale of Devastation, but you and I both know that that's not cheating. You still got to pay the full mana cost, unless you're playing like Asmo or something. But here, we don't have blink effects because we're not in the right colors for it, right? We can't really take advantage of 2 triggers or cheap triggers out of this creature, so we're playing these cards extremely fairly. And though these cards are really, really good when you're ahead and very, very good with our commander out, that slots them really nicely into win more, doesn't it, right? I understand in neutral they can still be pretty fine, where like after a board clear you can slam down Deep Forest Hermit and feel pretty good. However, after a board clear, aren't you just casting your commander first so you can do things of like, for example, play the Deep Forest Hermit and then tap all these tokens down to generate the mana off of your commander, right? Like, you want to still go in the other direction. So these cards start getting a little more and more unappealing to me. It's close. I'm putting a lot of scrutiny on this because once again I want this to be an exercise of how we should examine these cards. And honestly, if you put in like Entomb and Reanimate, if you put in Unmarked Grave and Reanimate, or Unmarked Grave and Life and Death, I like these cards way more immediately because I think they're very, very strong. But outside of turns where you are getting ready to combo off, I find them to be particularly weak. Once again, I am basing this on the power level I am assuming your opponents have, because your opponents will either be holding up counter magic for these kind of turns or are threatening to present a lethal strike very, very soon, right? So that's a bit tough for me on those two. Maha, Its Feathers Knight, I have more problems with. I love Maha. Maha is such a cool card. Flavor, I love that card Fell that depicts Maha. Very, very, very cool. Unfortunately, outside of flavor, just predominantly does not belong here. I do understand there's some cute little combos here and there, and we could even lean into it further by using some, effects that will give -1/-1 across the board for our opponents or something like that. But even then, I just don't think it's good enough. Maha is a clumsy threat, right? It doesn't do anything on attack on enter the battlefield, outside realistically saying you can't block my squirrels. Or you can block my squirrels, but all my squirrels get Death Touch. That's a much better way of doing this. Maha is 5 mana, all your squirrels get Death Touch. Is that worth 5 mana? I don't really think so. I mean, like, this is competing in slot with something like Shieldred, right? Which is way, way stronger. This is competing in slot with things that are better than it at lower mana, like Ruthless Technomancer and things like that. So though it's a wonderful flavor inclusion, I'm just really not interested in this effect. Man, I am mean to these cards. The Odd Acorn Gang, on the other hand, I like way more. This has an immediate impact on the battlefield, even if it's a little clumsy, because we need to do things at sorcery speed after it. But it also has the immediate impact of whenever one or more squirrels you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card, which means you can draw up to 3 cards as long as you hit 3 players. I like this way better. I think this is way stronger because it enables you to do something that this deck struggles with. Drawing cards in theme, but much more importantly, going tall instead of wide. This deck is extremely good at going wide. It is very bad at going tall, and the Odd Acorn King offers that solution really well. And the fact that it gives trample means you don't even really need to worry about keeping the Odd Acorn Gang a trampling creature as your main attacker. You can still invest all of these abilities onto one squirrel token so that if your opponents remove it, you feel less bad. Yes, it's a huge commitment, but it is a very powerful commitment. So I do really like this card, and I do think it's particularly worth 5 mana. If you were to play Concordant Crossroads, which is not on my edition list, but something I really do like, I would like this card even more. But at the moment, I think it's very good. I think this is the power of a 4 mana slot that I'm looking at. Likewise, Igra, another flavorful inclusion, is so good in this deck. It combos off with a lot of how the deck works. It solves one of the primary problems that this deck has, which is incongruity, between creature sacrifices and artifact sacrifices, and it pressures your opponent's boards in a way that honestly most players will not be prepared for. When all artifact destroying effects now can target any creature, it's immensely strong. Not even including the fact that Igra has a very good ward trigger. Once again, for some reason, black gets the best ward triggers, but also the food, like the fact that Igra grows by 2s really quickly, is amazing. Fortunately, Igra does not have evasion, but you are in the colors to give trample or menace, so that can be done very easily. Once again, huge fan of this card. I think this is good. Going to the last two, I have this problem with these two that's kind of unanimous between them, and like I don't want to go too long because I want to hit a few 4 mana things as well. But they are both outclassed by lower mana cost cards, right? Eldrazi Monument, I will say, is the stronger of the two because it represents abilities that are a little trickier to get, namely flying and indestructible, but getting +1/+1 is nothing special, and you can do that at 3 mana, so you really have to be taking advantage of the flying, which this deck can also already do with trample effects, so it's not that unique, so it has to be the indestructibility that you're taking advantage of. But squirrels are traditionally really bad indestructible creatures because you're going to attack with all of them, right? And your opponent will either have to deal with that or be able to block it out. And then if you are being attacked, holding up indestructible squirrels as defense is cool and all, but like I feel like a lot of opponents will either fly through or find another evasive way to get through, so it's not as much of a wall as you'd like it to be. So though I do like it, and this is a card I really do enjoy, it does particularly feel like overpaying for an effect, but not as much as Swarmyard Massacre. I'm sorry, I know this is a really cool, flavorful card, and I like that it is a one-sided board clear most of the time, because I will say spider, squirrel, insect, and rat are a group of kindred types that people love to play, at least in my play group. I know someone with a straight up spider deck. I know someone with a straight up rat deck. I know people with squirrel decks, and I definitely know people with insect decks. So you bring this, and sometimes it doesn't do what you need to do, is going to be heartbreaking. That being said, I gotta ask, how often would you rather this just be Damnation? How often would you rather this be Toxic Deluge? And I know it's not a good one-for-one comparison because the ceiling on Swarmyard Massacre is so high, but we are being nitpicky. And the nit that I'm picking is that I like this card after we've already put in Damnation, after we've already put in Toxic Deluge. Like, not both, but one or the other, right? Once we have at least one universal board clear that just says, this needs to go, like this needs to be, this just destroys everything, then I'm down for Swarmyard Massacre, because then I don't feel as bad of having a board clear that just doesn't necessarily clear the board, right? So that's kind of like a personal feeling I have, very much so. I said earlier that I would like things to be simplified. This is kind of what I mean. I want cards that do their one effect really well and efficiently, and I am less interested in cards that do that same effect but like fancily and then miss things, right? Okay, looking over here in 4 mana, I'm just going to hit a few really fast. Generally, I do like these. Hazel's Brewmaster is really cool. I'm going to withhold judgment because I want to play with this card to understand how good it is. It seems meta dependent. That doesn't make it bad, but it is something worth noting. I would also note that these 4 mana cards are on the same mana value curve as our commanders, so once again we need to be a little more critical. Rootcast Apprenticeship is a card that I get why it's in here. It's really weird. This is, I have a, like, it feels extremely underpowered if not for this one line of text, right? This one line of text that says choose 3, you choose 3, and you've got 3 kind of okay abilities, and then you have one really good one, which is create a token copy of target token you control. Now, I have to ask this. We have to look at it this way. If this had the word populate instead, which once again, this deck is designed that populate is just going to be fine enough most of the cases, but if this said populate, would you play this card? I would say probably not, because there are better populate cards, there's instant speed populate cards, and that will mirror your commander's ability way better than this will. So, what do we have here instead? We have a series of abilities that are just not good to validate one good ability that kind of mirrors what your commander does, and at the same mana value. Like, this is bad, right? Maybe I'm going to be a little mean right now. This is just a bad card. It's kind of weird that in such a push set that this card is so bad in comparison to everything else. If you can somehow use this line of text here to its highest ability, like I'm talking about doing like one of those Desolation Twin, the Eldrazi that summons a 10/10 Eldrazi token, and then you cast Rootcast Apprenticeship, yeah, that's good. Oh, you know what? I didn't read you may choose the same mode more than once. Okay, my B. I don't know, I still don't like it. Okay, I'm not just trying to be consistent in my feelings and not... Obviously, this is way better because you can target, use this ability 3 times and ignore the other abilities. And I guess this ability gets way better, but still pretty bad. This ability is just terrible, and this ability is just terrible. So honestly, you're casting this to do this ability 3 times. Is that still good? I still don't think so. I think you have to spread these abilities around, because otherwise if you pick the same target 3 times, someone with interaction will just really be excited for removing the token. If that's not the case and you are picking like what, 2 squirrels and a food, or 1 good target and 2 food, I think that's still particularly bad. What I was saying before is the Desolation Twin. Using this with Desolation Twin is kind of neat, but like, even then, I just don't like this. I just feel like it's really win more when it's good, and the rest of the time it's just lacking. So I'm going to move on from this because I got to get to additions soon, but I really don't like it. Likewise, Second Harvest, kind of the same feeling. I like this a little more, which is saying something because I really don't like Second Harvest. because it's instant speed, because it doesn't target, because it can do really, really good things when you have like 10 tokens, and it's still fine when you have like 4 tokens. So I do like this, but it kind of still sucks. It's still kind of a card that's win more that I don't particularly like. But considering I was just really, really hard on Rootcast Apprenticeship, I'm going to say Second Harvest can kind of stay. Maskwood Nexus, last note before we go into additions. I don't like this card, but that doesn't mean it's not a good card. I want to be particular. I know this entire channel is my soapbox, but I can differentiate between my feelings and what's probably true. And my feelings really don't like this card, but what's probably true, it's better than I'm giving it credit for. I would like to see realistically how often it is relevant for this card to be turning something that's not a squirrel into a squirrel, which I will admit there's quite a few cards where I do think it is relevant here, but the consistency of it is the thing I'm a little unsure of. Because if we really like this ability, why aren't we playing one of the other effects that does the same thing, right? That's something that comes to mind immediately. That's the first question. And if we're playing this for the second ability, the Squirrel Generation, like Squirrel Nest and a few other cards, I think do better impressions in a more realistic way, and I do like that way more. So with that in mind, I don't like it, but don't let that stop you. Okay, let's go into additions. Once again, I don't have a lot of additions, but I think they're pretty good additions. And the first one I think is the most important one. I think it is a crime, not like not like the magic mechanic. I mean a real life you're going to prison crime, to not play Cauldron Familiar in this deck. This card does so much work for you just by existing, right? Like if you have Zulaport Cutthroat, Viscera Seer, and just a handful of food and Cauldron Familiar, you can generate so much damage so quickly and be particularly difficult to interact with. I might be playing with this card in Modern right now to try something for fun, but the resilience of this cat is something that needs to be considered. Like, think about these scenarios. So you have, like I said, Viscera Seer, Cauldron Cat, let's say the cat's in the graveyard, as Zulaport Cutthroat and food. If you sacrifice a food and try to bring the Cauldron Familiar, and someone tries to interact, they try to destroy your Viscera Seer, they try to exile Cauldron Familiar, anything like that, you can just sack a second food. Yeah, you're losing that first food, but you can still just go on ignoring that ability. Like ignoring that trigger, Cauldron Familiar comes into play. If when Cauldron Familiar comes into play and its ability goes on the stack and someone tries to interact, well, once again, Viscera Seer can just sacrifice it again and put it in the graveyard, letting that ability, that trigger just linger and eventually come off. It's just really, really hard to interact with this card, and it once again solves that problem that I think this deck has of having the incongruity between food sacrifice and creature sacrifice. Hold on. Food sacrifice and creature sacrifice. It is important because now all of your cards are doing double duty, whereas before they would affect one. Not all of them, but most would affect one side or the other. So I think this is huge and absolutely needs to be played. Just a phenomenal card. After that, I have Carrion Feeder. I just would like another 1-mana sack outlet. If you've watched my videos for some time, you do know I tend to pair Carrion Feeder and Viscera Seer almost like conjoined twins. If you're playing one, I think it's really, really difficult to say don't play the second one. And this is the one I play. It's just really difficult to not justify the second. It's just really, really good to have 2 copies of these effects, and they are close enough that I think that you won't mind which one you draw into, especially for this deck. And especially this gives you another way to go tall, as I mentioned before, which can be very, very valuable in a deck like this. After that, this is another sack outlet, but one I think is equally strong. You have Clan Ironworks. This is Ashnod's Altar. They both hit different halves, and I do particularly like having both of them. They're just really, really good. And the combination of Ashnod's Altar, how it generates colorless mana, and how your commander generates colored mana, works really, really well together to enable you to play a lot of your bigger spells. And I do really like that. So I think that inclusion is easy as well. Another inclusion that I like back on the tall train, that's just a great thought, a tall train. Tarion Soulcleaver really, really is good in a deck like this. I think it is underestimated how powerful that ability is, mainly because this card tends to compete in slot with Shadow Spear, and this card can't beat Shadow Spear, 100%. But Tarion Soulcleaver were in a especially artifact aristocrat deck, because artifacts in a deck like this are way easier to sacrifice than creatures, but you get both, is extraordinarily powerful. Vigilance is fine, it's really cool on your commander and solves that whole weird idea about your commander being a 3/5. Give her Tarion Soulcleaver, make her like a 5/7 attack and then tap after combat. Really, really good, but as always, the tokens do not go on Tarion Soulcleaver, it goes on the creature. This is kind of Blade of the Bloodchief stuff, right? So you can then move the Soulcleaver onto another creature when you feel that first creature has become enough of a liability, and by that I mean your opponents are going to target it, then you can just start putting your eggs in another basket really, really easily, while, these effects will be triggered off of you doing what you already want to do in your deck. So good, so wonderful. I really do like it. I don't think I added in here, and if I did, I think there's actually an argument for Urza Saga in this deck between Tarion Soulcleaver, Skullclamp, and Soul Ring, and you could add a few more 1-mana cards, artifacts. I think there's an argument that you could play Urza Saga and be very, very happy with it. Do note, I don't like counting Urza Saga as a land because it doesn't last forever, so don't think that by putting Urza Saga you get to 31 lands. I'm watching you. You gotta put more lands. Stridehanger Automaton is a very interesting card. This is kind of like scratching my brain in a cool way. This is something that's come out of the newest Commander set, and so basically what it does is it diversifies your game plan yet again. It says whenever one or more artifact tokens, in this case it would be the food tokens, sorry, that took all my brain. The food tokens now generate bodies as well. Once again, it's the whole theme that I want to combine the creature and the artifact aristocrats, but Stridehanger does even further because one, it is again a lord for this effect and creating 2/2s, but much more importantly, the Thopters are artifact creatures. So just by themselves, with no additional effort, do they work double time for all of these cards. I hope you're picking up what I'm putting down. Like, these kind of cards I think are deceptively strong in a deck like this and allow you to get a little more juice out of the fruit, right? Just get your creatures and your effects to go just a little further, and while being a token generator and a token buffer specifically for its own tokens, and a 1/4, honestly, this is a very, very strong card, and I think it would do very well here. Coming to the end, I think, or at least the last few, Idol of Oblivion is one that I really do think is missing. Idol of Oblivion, I think, belongs in any deck that feels like it can generate a token a turn for like 4 turns at least. 2 mana Phyrexian Arena is really, really good. And yes, you have to tap it every time. Yes, you do need to create a token, but I think it is worth the deck building constraint, and in this deck you've already met the constraint. And of course, as we know, I buried the lead earlier, this generates a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi token, which can be cloned by your commander and by that other effect I don't particularly like, the Apprenticeship. And 10/10s are a way of being tall while still furthering a game plan, and I do really, really like that. That being said, that might attract too much attention. Like, I think this card is much better on its front side than its back side, but it is, I'd say front side is back side as in its the first half and second half. I'm sure you understood. But even with that in mind, a 10/10, like, post-endgame bad board clear situation, being able to get that first 10/10 is still very valuable, but I think you'll probably miss the first half more often than the second half. Cash grab. This should be in here, right? This is on theme, generates a food token. It's just a really good card. I don't have much to say about it. I think this is just a really solid card that does a lot in your deck. I think it should be there. And it's not often that I suggest a card that is on flavor and strong, so here you go. Finally, I think the last cards I was thinking about are reanimation effects. Unearth is standing in, as I said before, for reanimate, life and death, all animate dead, all these kind of effects. I would start with Unearth. I think it's good enough. Aristocrat decks really benefit from these effects, and you've got so many really good cards, 3 mana or less, that I think it is worth running. And likewise, Dread Return, I think, just deserves a special shout out because of its sheer power level, especially once again in a deck like this. If you can temporary turn artifacts into creature, I think this is nuts, but you have enough ways to generate additional creatures, such as the legendary green-black, green ability, black ability green creature, Chatterfang, that's the one, to generate more bodies really easily. That makes a card like Dread Return really, really powerful. I think that's the last one. Oh, the last one is Revitalizing Repast. Just ending it with the final reminder, please play more lands. But you're in black-green, you get to play one of the, I think, the strongest in Commander's dual MDFCs, because just this first part is just really, really good, and this being a pretty decent tap land in your colors is also very, very good. So please do not sleep on this. Okay, we made it! This video went longer than I thought and longer than I hoped, but I did like looking at this deck. It's really, really good. It looks really, really fun. Please, Shirok, please play more lands. I'm begging you. Otherwise, I am excited to see where this deck goes. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there is a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.